Asterisk, asterisk. Part 1. The Old Soldier and the Judge's Offer. Asterisk, asterisk. The dust of Independence, Missouri, was a living thing in the summer of 1872. It was the dust of 1,000 hooves, 1,000,000 dreams, and countless farewells. It rose in fine, choking clouds from the unpaved streets, coating the sun-bleached clapboard of the saloons, the general store, and the land office. It settled on the sweat-slicked backs of horses and the canvas tops of Conestoga wagons groaning under the weight of a family's entire worldly possessions. Independence was not a destination. It was a wound in the earth from which the lifeblood of America bled westward, a chaotic, hopeful exodus toward the promise of Colorado gold, Oregon soil, or Californian sun, in the dim, beer-sour air of the Last Chance Saloon. Elijah Cole watched this world through the bottom of a whiskey glass. The dust didn't bother him. It was an old acquaintance, a constant companion from the battlefields of the South to the desolate plains he now called his hunting ground. At 40, Elijah wore the landscape on his face. The sun had etched fine lines around eyes the color of a faded winter sky, eyes that held the flat, distant look of a man who had seen too much civilization and not enough of its virtues. His shoulders, which had once worn a Union blue cavalry uniform with pride, now stooped slightly under the invisible weight of memory. The war had given him medals he never polished and nightmares he couldn't shake. It had taken his youth and left him with a particular set of skills: how to read the land, how to handle a Colt, and how to tell when a man was lying. Now, he made a meager living selling those skills to the highest bidder, guiding greenhorns who thought the West was a picture in a pamphlet, or providing muscle for cattle drives. He was a man adrift, anchored only by a past he couldn't escape. The saloon doors swung open, not with the swagger of a cowboy or the stumble of a drunk, but with a deliberate, commanding push that cut through the low murmur of the room. The man who entered was an island of black wool in a sea of buckskin and denim. His suit was impeccably tailored, his collar starched white despite the oppressive heat, and his polished leather shoes seemed to rebuke the dusty floorboards. He was tall, silver-haired, with a face carved from granite and impatience. This was a man accustomed to courtrooms and boardrooms, not barrooms. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept the room and landed on Elijah as if by magnetic pull. Elijah didn't move. He'd seen men like this before, men who wielded power like a weapon and believed money could purchase anything, including a man's soul. He took a slow sip of his whiskey as the man approached, his footsteps precise and soundless. "They say you are Elijah Cole," the man stated, his voice a low, cultured rumble that was utterly out of place. It was not a question. Elijah set his glass down. "They say a lot of things in this town. Most of them aren't true." A flicker of annoyance crossed the man's features, but it was quickly suppressed. "My name is Judge Lawrence Whitmore, of Boston. I have been reliably informed that you are the most capable guide and protector for hire in Independence." Elijah grunted, a non-committal sound. "Depends on the job, and the pay. The pay will be more than sufficient," the judge said, dismissing the topic as a mere formality. He slid onto the stool next to Elijah, placing a leather satchel on the bar. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of discipline and absolute self-control. "I have a task, a consignment, if you will, to be delivered to Denver." Elijah's interest was piqued, but his expression remained impassive. "Consignment, I move people and livestock. Judge, not freight." "The consignment," Judge Whitmore clarified, his voice dropping, "is my daughter." Elijah turned his head slowly to look at the man. The judge's eyes were like chips of ice, revealing nothing. This was not the plea of a concerned father. This was a business transaction. "Your daughter. Her name is Josephine," the judge continued, as if discussing a legal brief. "She is to be married to Mr. Harrison Blackwood in Denver. I'm sure you've heard the name. His mining interests are..." considerable. Elijah had heard of Blackwood. His name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear from Missouri to the Rockies. A man who had carved an empire out of the mountains, whose wealth was matched only by his ruthlessness. So, you want me to escort a lady to her wedding? Sounds simple enough. Why me? Any man with a wagon and a rifle could do it. Because the trail is not safe, the judge said flatly. And my daughter, she can be spirited. She does not fully appreciate the importance of this union. I require a man who will not be swayed by feminine wiles or temperaments. I require a man who understands duty and can ensure, without fail, that she arrives in Denver safely and on schedule. Your reputation suggests you are such a man. Elijah felt a familiar, cold knot form in his stomach. Escorting a reluctant bride-to-be across 700 miles of hostile territory sounded like a special kind of hell. It smelled of family drama and hidden agendas, the kind of trouble that couldn't be solved with a bullet. My price is $200, Elijah said, naming a figure he was sure would end the conversation. Half now, half on arrival. The judge didn't even blink. He opened his satchel and produced a stack of crisp banknotes, counting out $100 onto the bar. Done. You will also be provided with a sturdy wagon, supplies, and funds for any necessary expenses along the trail. You will be responsible for her and her personal maid. You leave at dawn 2 days from now. Elijah stared at the money. It was more than he'd made in the last 6 months. It was enough to buy a small piece of land somewhere quiet, somewhere the ghosts of the war might finally leave him be. He thought of the endless plains, the hard ground, the lonely campfires. Then he thought of the money. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and slid the bills into his worn leather wallet. "Where can I meet the lady?" he asked, his voice rough. "We are at the Independence Grand Hotel. Room 204 inches, the judge replied, rising from his stool. Be there in 1 hour. I wish for you to be introduced, so there are no misunderstandings." He gave a curt nod and walked out, leaving a void of silence in his wake. Elijah finished his whiskey, the cheap liquor burning a path down his throat. He was being paid to escort a rich girl to her wedding, but the cold knot in his gut told him he was walking into something far more complicated than a simple journey west. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Independence Grand Hotel was a fragile bubble of Boston refinement in a world of mud and manure. Its lobby was hushed, adorned with velvet curtains and polished mahogany furniture that seemed to sweat in the Missouri heat. It was a world away from the Last Chance Saloon, and as Elijah Cole stepped inside, hat in hand, he felt the weight of a dozen disapproving stares. He had washed his face and brushed the worst of the trail dust from his clothes, but he knew he still looked like what he was, a piece of the wilderness that had wandered indoors. Judge Whitmore was waiting for him, his posture as rigid as the hotel's columns. He led Elijah up the grand staircase without a word, their footsteps echoing in the opulent silence. Outside room 204, the judge paused, his hand on the doorknob. "A word of advice, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice low and hard. "My daughter is educated, refined. She has strong opinions. You are not being paid for your opinions. You are being paid for her safe delivery. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Elijah said, his face a mask of stone. The judge nodded once and opened the door. The suite was the grandest in the hotel, filled with heavy, dark furniture and trunks overflowing with silk and lace. By the window, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light, stood a young woman. As she turned, Elijah felt an unexpected jolt. He had been expecting a pampered, soft creature. Josephine Whitmore was not soft. She was tall and slender, with a cascade of dark auburn hair pinned in an elaborate style that must have taken an hour to construct. Her dress was of deep emerald silk, a testament to wealth and fashion. But it was her face that held him. It was a composition of sharp, intelligent angles, high cheekbones, a determined chin, and a full mouth set in a line of stubborn defiance. But it was her eyes, the color of moss and whiskey, that truly defined her. They were ablaze with a cold, furious fire. This was not a woman going to her wedding. This was a queen being led to her execution. "Father," she said, her voice clear and laced with ice, "to what do I owe this intrusion?" "Josephine, this is Mr. Elijah Cole," the judge announced, his tone brooking no argument. "He will be your escort to Denver." Josephine's fiery gaze swept over Elijah, from the worn toes of his boots to the weary lines on his face. It was a look of instant, undisguised contempt. He was the hired help, a coarse, weathered man who smelled of dust and horses and something vaguely dangerous. He was everything her world was not. "You have hired this man to drag me across the country like a parcel?" she asked, her words dripping with scorn. She did not even deign to look at Elijah as she spoke to her father. "I have hired him to ensure your safety," the judge corrected coolly. "A task which, given your present disposition, may prove challenging." Elijah stood silent. Observing, he saw the pride, the fury, but underneath it, he saw something else fear, the sharp, glittering fear of a caged animal. He saw a woman who was used to controlling her world, now utterly powerless. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of young soldiers on their first march into battle. "I will not go," Josephine stated, her chin lifting higher. "I will not be sold like livestock to a man I have never met, for a piece of some God-forsaken mountain." "You will go." The judge's voice was like the crack of a whip. "This is not a negotiation. It is a matter of family honor and a strategic alliance that will secure our future. Harrison Blackwood is a powerful man. You will be his wife. This discussion is over." He turned to Elijah. "Mr. Cole will see to the final preparations. You will be ready to depart at dawn, 2 days hence." With that, the judge turned and left the room, closing the door with a final, authoritative click. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Josephine stood frozen for a moment, her back rigid. Elijah remained by the door, patient as a predator. He could feel the storm brewing inside her. Finally, she turned to face him fully. Her eyes narrowed. "I do not know what my father has paid you, Mr. Cole, but I assure you it is not enough." "The judge and I have an understanding, ma'am," Elijah said, his voice even and calm. It was the voice he used to soothe spooked horses. "Do you," she shot back, "do you understand that you are a party to kidnapping, that you have been hired to enforce a contract of servitude?" Elijah met her gaze without flinching. "I understand I've been hired to take you to Denver. The rest is between you and your father." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "How wonderfully simple your world must be. Mr. Cole, a problem arises, you draw your gun, a man offers you money. You take it, no thought for morality, for justice. Justice is a luxury out on the trail, ma'am," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Survival is the only currency that matters. You do well to remember that." He saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before the anger returned, stronger than before. She was looking for a crack in his armor, a weakness to exploit. "I will make this journey a living nightmare for you," she vowed, her voice low and trembling with rage. "Every mile, every hour. You will regret the day you ever heard the name Whitmore." Elijah held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the spoiled daughter of a rich man. He saw the fire and the pride. And deep down, he saw the terrified young woman trapped by circumstance. He felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, but he quickly extinguished it. Pity was a dangerous emotion in his line of work. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I'll keep that in mind, ma'am," he said. He then turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in her gilded cage. As he walked down the hall, the image of her furious, frightened eyes burned in his mind. The judge was right about one thing. This job was not going to be simple. It was a powder keg, and he'd just been hired to carry the lit match. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 2. The Thorny Trail, asterisk, asterisk. Dawn broke over Independence not with a gentle blush, but as a sharp, bloody gash across the eastern horizon. The air was cool, holding the promise of the brutal heat to come. The sounds of the waking town, the first clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the crowing of a rooster. The low murmur of men readying their teams faded behind them as Elijah Cole guided the sturdy box wagon onto the Santa Fe Trail. The great westward artery was already teeming with life, a slow-moving river of canvas and wood. But Elijah soon veered them onto a less traveled northern fork. The trail to Denver was lonelier, and in loneliness, there was a measure of safety. Inside the wagon, Josephine Whitmore sat on a padded bench, her spine as straight and unyielding as a fence post. Every jolt of the wheels on the rutted path was a personal affront, a crude reminder of her forced exile. Beside her, her maid, Mary, a small, bird-like woman with perpetually worried eyes, clutched a rosary, her lips moving in a silent, constant prayer. Mary had been with Josephine since childhood, a loyal shadow who was now terrified of the vast, empty world opening up before them. For the first few days, a suffocating silence reigned, broken only by the creak of the wagon and Mary's occasional, nervous sighs. Josephine had erected a wall of icy disdain around herself. She looked out at the rolling prairies, an endless sea of grass under an achingly vast sky, and saw not beauty, but a profound and terrifying emptiness. This was the Thoketch, the crude, unrefined world she had always scorned. The food, cooked over a campfire by Elijah, consisted of salted bacon, hard biscuits, and coffee thick enough to chew. The water, drawn from streams and tasting of earth, was a far cry from the cool, clean water of Boston. Every evening, she would watch Elijah work with a critical eye. He moved with an efficient, practiced grace that irritated her the way he tended to the horses first, his voice a low murmur to the animals, the way he could start a fire with a single flint strike, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, missing nothing. He was, she had to admit, competent, but in her mind, it was the competence of a beast of burden, not of a man. He was a tool her father had purchased. Elijah, for his part, seemed entirely untroubled by her silent contempt. He kept his distance, respecting the invisible line she had drawn. He treated her with a perfunctory politeness, addressing her as ma'am, but his words were always blunt, stripped of any pleasantry. "Mr. Cole," she said one afternoon, her voice tight with annoyance as he pulled the wagon to a halt in the shade of a meager cluster of cottonwoods. "It is barely past midday. Why are we stopping?" "Horses need water and rest," he replied without looking at her, already unhitching the team. "We push them too hard in this heat, they'll break. A lame horse out here is a death sentence." "Surely we can press on for another hour or two," she insisted. He finally turned, his pale eyes pinning her. "No, ma'am, we can't. The sun and the trail make the rules out here, not the clock." His directness was jarring. The men she knew in Boston would have deferred to her, would have placated her with flowery apologies and explanations. Elijah offered only the hard, unvarnished truth. It left her fuming and, to her deep annoyance, with nothing more to say. She was bickering about an hour while he was talking about life and death. The realization was as bitter as his coffee. The incident repeated itself in different forms. When she complained about the monotonous diet, he simply said, "It's fuel. It'll get us to Denver." When she recoiled from a snake he calmly dispatched near their camp. He tossed it into the bushes and remarked, "Everything out here is either trying to eat or trying not to be eaten." He was a part of this harsh land, as rugged and unyielding as the landscape itself, and while she hated him for it, a strange, unwelcome seed of curiosity began to sprout in the barren ground of her anger. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve, a man who seemed completely indifferent to her station, her wealth, and her fury. He was the first person in her life who had ever treated her not as Josephine Whitmore, the judge's daughter, but as a piece of fragile cargo that needed to be managed. On the 5th day, the sky began to change. The brilliant, merciless blue bleached to a sickly, yellowish gray. The wind died, and a heavy, oppressive stillness settled over the plains. The horses grew nervous, tossing their heads and stamping their feet. "What is it?" Mary whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the wagon seat. Elijah, riding his own horse a few yards ahead, had already stopped. He scanned the horizon, his face grim. "Dust storm. A bad one. Get inside the wagon, both of you. Cover your faces with a wet cloth if you have one." He worked quickly, leading his horse to the side of the wagon to act as a partial windbreak and pulling a heavy canvas tarp over the animals' heads. He had just finished when the horizon disappeared, a monstrous, churning wall of brown dust, hundreds of feet high, bore down on them with the speed of a freight train. The world dissolved into a roaring, suffocating chaos. The wind howled like a banshee, rocking the wagon violently. Dust, fine as flour, seeped through every crack, filling their mouths and noses, stinging their eyes. Josephine, huddled inside with a terrified Mary, felt a primal fear grip her. They were utterly blind, completely at the mercy of a force that could tear the wagon apart and scatter them across the prairie. And then, through the roar, she heard a new sound. Hoofbeats. Close! Elijah, positioned by the driver's seat, had his Colt drawn. His body was a tense line, his eyes straining to pierce the maelstrom. Out of the swirling brown haze, figures emerged like ghosts. 4 riders. They were hard-looking men with rifles laid across their saddles, their faces covered with bandanas. They circled the wagon slowly, their horses unbothered by the storm. They were predators in their natural element. The leader, a big man with a cruel twist to his lips visible above his bandana, trotted his horse closer. He had cold, intelligent eyes that sized up Elijah, the sturdy wagon, and the frightened faces of the women peering out. "Looks like you're in a spot of trouble, friend," the man shouted over the wind, a mocking grin in his voice. Elijah didn't flinch. His gun remained steady, aimed not directly at the man, but at the space between them, a silent promise. "We're managing," he called back, his voice unnervingly calm. The leader's eyes lingered on the wagon, a speculative gleam entering them. "That's a fine-looking rig, carrying something valuable." "Just my personal effects," Elijah said flatly. The man, who Elijah would later learn was the notorious outlaw Jake Bonner, let out a short, harsh laugh. He looked past Elijah, his gaze falling on Josephine. For a heart-stopping second, his eyes met hers. In them, she saw a complete and terrifying absence of humanity. He was not looking at a person. He was looking at an object, an item to be appraised and taken. The contempt she felt for Elijah was a childish tantrum compared to the violation she felt under this man's gaze. Bonner and his men exchanged glances. Elijah could see the calculation in their eyes. A direct confrontation in this storm was risky. He was one man, but he was ready. And they didn't know how well he could shoot. Hesitation flickered among them. "Well," Bonner said at last, pulling on his reins, "enjoy the weather." He gave a mock salute and spurred his horse, his men melting back into the dust as quickly as they had appeared. The hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the storm. For what felt like an eternity, they sat in the roaring darkness. Mary was openly sobbing, her prayers now desperate, choked pleas. Josephine was frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The image of Bonner's eyes was burned into her mind. That was the reality of this land. Not just snakes and dust, but men who looked at you and saw only profit. Men who could erase you from the world without a second thought. Gradually, The wind began to subside. The roar softened to a moan, and then a whisper. Light returned to the world, pale and filtered through a haze of dust. When Elijah finally pulled back the canvas, the landscape was transformed. Everything was coated in a fine brown powder, scoured and alien. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth. Elijah didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply went back to work. He calmed the trembling horses, checked the wagon for damage, and methodically began to clean the dust from his rifle. His movements were steady, reassuring in their normalcy. Josephine watched him, her throat tight. Her carefully constructed world of pride and prejudice had been shaken to its foundations. Her anger at her father, her contempt for her escort, it all seemed so petty, so meaningless in the face of what had just happened. Those riders hadn't cared that she was a Whitmore from Boston. They hadn't cared about her fine dress or her educated accent. And in that moment of terror, she hadn't cared either. The only thing that had stood between her and the terrifying emptiness in Jake Bonner's eyes was the calm, steady presence of the man she had dismissed as a simple hireling. That evening, the campfire felt different. It wasn't just a source of heat, but a fragile circle of light in an immense, threatening darkness. Mary was asleep in the wagon, exhausted by her fear. Josephine sat on a log, a tin cup of coffee in her hands, watching Elijah clean his pistol by the firelight. The silence between them was no longer hostile, but filled with the unspoken weight of the day. Finally, she broke it, her voice barely a whisper. Who were they? Elijah didn't look up from his work. Vultures, men who follow the trails looking for the weak or the unprepared. The leader's name is Jake Bonner. He's got a reputation for being smart and mean. Will they come back? The question was quiet. Stripped of its usual haughty tone, it was the question of a frightened woman. He stopped his work and looked at her then, his gaze direct and honest. There was no pity in it, only a shared understanding of the stakes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "They'll be back." He didn't offer false reassurances. He didn't tell her not to worry. He gave her the truth, as blunt and hard as ever. But for the first time, Josephine didn't feel anger or irritation. She felt a strange, cold comfort. He was treating her like an equal, a partner in their survival, not a package to be delivered. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by a wilderness that had just shown its teeth, a tiny, fragile thread of a connection had been spun. The trail ahead was still long and full of thorns, but for the first time, she wasn't entirely alone on it. **, Part 3. Campfire Light and Ghosts of the Past, **. They made camp that evening in a shallow basin carved by Campbell's Creek, a sliver of life-giving water that snaked through the prairie. The location offered some protection from the wind, and a stand of gnarled cottonwoods provided firewood. After the harrowing ordeal of the dust storm, the simple act of setting up camp felt like a reclaiming of order in a world that had descended into chaos. The fire Elijah built was larger than usual, a defiant roar of orange and yellow against the encroaching twilight. It pushed back the deepening shadows and the lingering chill of fear that had settled over them. In the distance, the lonely, mournful howl of a coyote drifted on the breeze, a sound that would have terrified Josephine a week ago, but now seemed like just another voice in the vast, wild choir. Mary, utterly drained, had retired to the wagon immediately after a meager supper, her rosary once again in hand. Josephine, however, found sleep impossible. The image of Jake Bonner's predatory eyes was seared into her memory. She sat on a fallen log across the fire from Elijah, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Though the night was not particularly cold, the silence stretched, no longer hostile, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Elijah was not a man given to idleness. He sat with his back against a saddle, meticulously cleaning his Colt Peacemaker. The firelight glinted off the oiled steel as he worked, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. To Josephine, the weapon had always been a symbol of the brutishness of this land, a tool for men of violence. Now, after seeing the riders emerge from the dust, she saw it differently. It was a provider of safety, an arbiter of survival. "You are very comfortable with that," she said, her voice quiet, barely disturbing the stillness. Elijah glanced up, his eyes catching the firelight. He paused, looking at the disassembled pieces in his lap. "It's been a long acquaintance," he replied, his tone flat. He began reassembling the firearm with a series of clean, efficient clicks. "Were you a soldier?" she asked, the question surprising her as much as it did him. It was the first personal question she had ever asked. He hesitated, the rhythmic clicking stopping for a moment. He spun the cylinder, listening to the sound before looking back at the flames. "I was," he said, the words carrying a weight that seemed to settle in the air between them. "First Colorado Cavalry." She pictured him younger, in a crisp blue uniform, a hero from the stories she'd read back in Boston. The image didn't quite fit the weary, solitary man before her. "My father speaks of the war with great pride. He says it was a noble cause that forged our nation in fire." A dry, mirthless sound, not quite a laugh, escaped Elijah's lips. "Judges and politicians in Boston saw a noble cause. We saw mud and blood. We saw boys, younger than you, who'd never been more than 10 miles from their farm, learning how to die for a line on a map." His voice was low, rough with memory. He wasn't speaking to her so much as to the ghosts that danced in the flames. You learn things in a war. You learn that a man can be brave one minute and gone the next. You learn the difference between the sound of a rifle and the sound of a carbine. You learn how to sleep standing up, and you learn how to forget the faces of the men you couldn't save. He fell silent, his gaze lost in the fire. Josephine felt a profound shift inside her. The chasm that had separated them of class, of education, of experience seemed to shrink. In his words, she heard not the hired hand, but a man haunted by a past she could scarcely imagine. She saw the source of the emptiness in his eyes. "Did you lose people?" she asked, her voice softer now, more tentative. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the fire. "I lost a whole world. My folks died of fever while I was away. My brother, he took a piece of shrapnel at Glorieta Pass. I was right there, held his hand. He was just telling me he wanted to go home and fix the roof on the barn." Elijah's voice cracked, just for a second, a fissure in the granite. By the time the war was over, there was nothing left to go home to. Just me. And this... He gently patted the worn wooden grip of the reassembled Colt resting on his thigh. An ache bloomed in Josephine's chest, an unfamiliar pang of empathy. Her own problems, a forced marriage to a rich man, a journey she did not wish to take, suddenly felt trivial. The complaints of a spoiled child. Here was a man who had lost everything, who walked the earth carrying the ghosts of his family and his friends. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words were inadequate, but they were all she had. He finally looked at her, his gaze clear and searching, as if seeing her for the first time. No need to be, it was a long time ago, but they both knew it wasn't. For him, it was yesterday. It was in that moment of shared vulnerability that she found the courage to admit her own fear. "I was so frightened today," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. When he looked at me, I've never felt so helpless. Back home, my name, my father's position. It's a shield. Out here, it means nothing. I mean nothing." Elijah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He saw the proud, defiant mask crumble, revealing the terrified young woman beneath. And in that moment, his professional detachment was breached. This was no longer just a job, a contract, a fierce, protective instinct, older and more powerful than any paid duty, stirred within him. He was dually tormented by it. His responsibility was to the judge's instructions, but his heart was beginning to answer to the woman before him. He was drawn to the fire in her. A fire he now saw was not arrogance. but a desperate fight for survival. Josephine, meanwhile, was fighting her own internal battle. A part of her, the Boston lady, screamed that she was being improper, sharing confidences with a common laborer. But another, newer part of her, the woman who had faced the dust storm and the outlaw's stare, knew that survival meant shedding the useless skin of her old life. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "You said they will come back," she said, looking at the pistol that now lay by his side. "I don't want to be helpless again. I want you to teach me how to use one of those." Elijah stared at her, surprised. The idea was preposterous. A lady like her handling a firearm? It was unthinkable. Guns were messy, loud, and deadly. They were not for hands accustomed to embroidery and piano keys. "Ma'am, that's not a good idea," he said, shaking his head. "A pistol's not a toy. It takes practice, and it's more likely to bring you trouble than get you out of it." "The trouble has already found us," she retorted, her chin lifting with a flicker of its old defiance, but her eyes pleaded with him. "You said it yourself. Out here, survival is the only currency. I have no currency. Mr. Cole, I am bankrupt. Please, I don't want to be a liability. I want to be able to defend myself, to defend Mary." He saw the resolve in her eyes. It was the same desperate determination he'd seen in farm boys being handed their first rifle. She wasn't asking for a parlor trick. She was asking for a chance. He was torn. His contract was to protect her, not arm her. An armed, emotional woman was a dangerous variable, but leaving her defenseless felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust they had just built. He let out a long, slow breath, the air hissing through his teeth. "All right," he said, his voice laced with reluctance. "Tomorrow, when the sun's up, but you'll do exactly as I say." "No arguments." "I promise," she said, a wave of relief washing over her. The next morning, after a breakfast eaten in a new, more comfortable silence, Elijah led her away from the camp, to a clearing by the creek. He carried a second pistol, a smaller Colt Navy that he kept in his saddlebags. He handed it to her, butt first. The weight of it shocked her. It was so much heavier than she'd imagined. A solid, dense piece of metal. It felt cold and menacing in her hand. "It's not a teacup," Elijah said, his voice all business. "Hold it with both hands for now. Feel the balance of it." He stood close, his presence a solid wall at her back. He adjusted her grip, his calloused, rough fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a strange, unexpected warmth through her. It was a purely practical touch, yet it felt more intimate than any polite handshake she had ever received. "You don't aim with your eyes," he explained, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "You aim with your whole body, your feet, your shoulders, your arm. You become the gun." He set up a tin can on a rock 50 feet away. "Don't try to hit it. Just get a feel for it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Let it surprise you." Josephine took a deep breath, the smell of dust, leather, and Elijah filling her senses. She raised the heavy pistol, her arms trembling. She lined up the sight with the distant can, squinted, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that seemed to rip the air apart. The recoil slammed her backward, and she would have fallen if Elijah hadn't been standing right behind her, his hands steadying her shoulders. Her ears rang, and the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nose. The can remained untouched. A shaky, half-hysterical laugh bubbled out of her. "My God!" "Again," was all he said. They spent an hour like that. She fired again and again, the explosions becoming less shocking, the recoil less jarring. Her arms ached and her ears hummed, but she slowly began to understand. She learned to control her breathing, to stand her ground, to make the weapon an extension of her will. Finally, on her last shot, a loud asterisk ping asterisk echoed through the clearing. The can flew off the rock. She lowered the pistol, her arm trembling with exhaustion. and stared at the empty rock. A profound sense of accomplishment, fierce and raw, coursed through her. It was nothing like winning a debate or playing a flawless piece on the pianoforte. This was different. This was real. She turned to Elijah, a real, unguarded smile touching her lips for the first time. "I did it?" He looked at her, his face unreadable, but there was a new light in his eyes, a flicker of respect. "You did," he confirmed. He took the pistol from her, his fingers once again brushing hers. "Don't ever point it at anything you're not willing to destroy." As they walked back to camp, the heavy pistol now cleaned and tucked into her own travel bag, Josephine felt a fundamental change had taken place. She was no longer just Josephine Whitmore of Boston, a piece of property being shipped west. She was a woman holding the means of her own survival. She had faced her fear, and with the help of the gruff, haunted man walking beside her, she had taken her first, faltering step into the savage, unforgiving, and strangely liberating world of the West. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 4, Blood on the Trail. Asterisk, asterisk. The days that followed Josephine's first lesson with the Colt Navy were marked by a subtle but profound shift in the air between them. The landscape itself seemed to conspire with this change, the gentle, rolling prairies giving way to a more broken and rugged country. Hills became bluffs of rust-colored rock, and the trail began to wind through shallow canyons and arroyos that baked under the relentless sun. The world felt smaller, more enclosed, and with it came a rising sense of claustrophobia, a feeling that danger could be lurking behind any rock or in any shadowed ravine. Josephine practiced with the pistol every day. The ritual became a part of their routine, as essential as watering the horses or making coffee. She never recaptured the lucky satisfaction of that first hit, but her hands grew steadier, her arms stronger. The explosions no longer made her flinch. The weapon began to feel less like a foreign object and more like a tool, its weight a grim but comforting presence in her satchel. Elijah watched her progress with a quiet, unreadable expression. He corrected her stance, reminded her to breathe, but offered little praise. His approval was a rare and valuable commodity, and she found herself, to her own surprise, striving for it. They were 2 weeks out of independence, deep in territory where the only law was the speed of a man's draw, when the afternoon quiet was shattered. It started as a faint popping sound, carried on the wind. To Josephine's untrained ear, it could have been anything, the crack of a dry branch, a rock slide in the distance. But Elijah went rigid in his saddle. He reined in his horse, his head cocked, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the low hills ahead. "What is it?" Josephine asked, pulling their wagon to a halt beside him. "A gunfire," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "Stay here, and stay down." Before she could protest, he spurred his horse forward. Not recklessly, but with a cavalryman's instinct for terrain, keeping to the low ground, using a line of scraggly junipers for cover. He disappeared over a nearby rise. Josephine was left alone with Mary, who had already begun her frantic, whispered prayers. The popping sounds became louder, more distinct now, the sharp crack of rifles answered by the deeper boom of a shotgun. A man shouted, his voice faint and desperate, followed by a woman's scream that was cut brutally short. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. Elijah's order had been absolute: stay here. The Boston lady inside her, the one who fainted at the sight of a mouse, screamed for her to obey, to hide, to cower in the wagon and wait for the man who was paid to handle such things. But the woman who had held the weight of a pistol in her hands, who had looked into an outlaw's eyes, refused to be helpless. Her hands, acting of their own accord, went to her satchel and closed around the cold, familiar grip of the Colt. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, Elijah reappeared at the crest of the hill, motioning for her to come forward, his movements urgent. She slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched into motion, Mary clinging to the seat beside her. As they reached the top of the rise, the scene below unfolded like a tableau from hell. A simple farm wagon, its canvas cover riddled with holes, was pinned down behind a rocky outcropping. One of its horses lay dead in its traces, and the other screamed. Its legs shattered. 3 riders were circling the outcropping, firing methodically, taking their time like wolves toying with their prey. Behind the rocks, a man lay on the ground, his shirt soaked with a dark, spreading stain, while a woman tried to load an old shotgun, her hands trembling. Huddled beside her was a girl, perhaps 16 or 17, her face a mask of pure terror. Elijah was already off his horse, his rifle in hand. "It's Bonner's men," he said, his voice grim. "Not all of them. The vultures picking off a stray." He looked at Josephine, his eyes boring into hers. There was no time for a debate. "I'm going to draw their fire. You get the wagon down behind that ridge there." He pointed. "Whatever you do, stay out of sight. If one of them breaks for you, you know what to do." He didn't wait for a reply. He moved with a lethal grace, a ghost in the landscape. Circling wide to come at the riders from their flank, Josephine steered the wagon, her knuckles white on the reins, her mind a whirlwind of terror and adrenaline. She got the wagon into the shallow ditch he'd indicated, a position that offered some cover but left her with a clear, horrifying view of the unfolding battle. Elijah opened fire. The crack of his rifle was sharp, authoritative. One of the riders cried out and slumped over his saddle, his own gun tumbling into the dust. The other 2, startled by the attack from an unseen enemy, wheeled their horses around, firing blindly into the rocks where Elijah had taken cover. The woman with the shotgun used the distraction. She rose, leveled the big gun over the rock, and fired both barrels. The blast echoed through the canyon. Another of the riders was blown clean off his horse, a ragged mess of denim and dust. Now there was only one left. But this one was different. He wasn't panicked. He saw his friends go down, and instead of fleeing, his head snapped around, his cold eyes finding the source of the new threat. He spurred his horse not at Elijah, but in a wide, circling gallop, heading straight for the besieged family's position from the side, aiming for the vulnerable spot Elijah couldn't cover. Josephine watched. Her breath caught in her throat. The man was a blur of motion, his pistol already raised. The woman was fumbling to reload the shotgun. The girl was paralyzed with fear, and Elijah was too far away to stop him. In that frozen moment, Josephine saw it all play out. The rider would reach the rocks, and the family would be finished. The helplessness she had felt in the storm threatened to drown her. But this time, she had a choice. "Don't ever point it at anything you're not willing to destroy." Elijah's words echoed in her ears. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely lift the pistol. She rested it on the side of the wagon box to steady it, the iron sight a wavering blur. The rider was 100 feet away, then 80, then 60. He was a huge, terrifying figure, a bringer of death. He wasn't a tin can on a rock. He was real. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, took a ragged breath, and remembered Elijah's instruction. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. She opened her eyes, aimed at the center of the man's charging form, and fired. The gun bucked in her hand. The roar was deafening. She had no idea if she'd hit him, but the rider let out a strangled cry. His horse stumbled, veering wildly off course. He didn't fall, but he clutched at his shoulder, his face contorted in pain and surprise as he fought to control his panicked mount. The shot had saved them. It had given Elijah the 1 second he needed. The sharp crack of his rifle sounded again, and this time, the last rider fell from his saddle and did not move. Silence. A ringing, profound silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded horse and the ragged sound of Josephine's own breathing. She lowered the pistol, her arm feeling like lead. The smell of gunpowder was thick in the air, a sickening perfume. Elijah rose from his cover, his rifle held ready, and slowly approached the scene. After a moment, He signaled that it was clear. Josephine, moving like a sleepwalker, climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. She approached the outcropping. The woman was holding her daughter, both of them sobbing with a mixture of terror and relief. The man on the ground was conscious, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Thank you," he rasped, his eyes finding Josephine. "God bless you. He was coming right for us." Josephine could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The woman looked up, her face tear-streaked. Can you help me with his leg? I don't know what to do." The Boston lady would have recoiled. The sight of the wound, a bloody, ragged tear in the man's trousers, would have sent her into a faint, but Josephine barely hesitated. She knelt in the dust, her mind strangely clear. "Mary, fetch the medical kit from our wagon, and the whiskey." She took the knife the woman offered and, with a steady hand, began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric. She worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed, cleaning the wound as best she could with supplies from their kit, helping the woman bind it tightly. Her hands were soon covered in the stranger's blood. It was warm and sticky. It was the price of survival. When they had done all they could, she stood up, her body aching. She looked down at her dress, an expensive traveling gown of dark blue wool. Near the hem, there was a dark, wet splash, a smear of the wounded man's blood. She stared at it, mesmerized. It wasn't just a stain, it was a brand, a mark of her initiation into this brutal world. The silk and lace of her past life had been irrevocably tainted by the grim reality of the trail. The woman she had been when she left Independence was gone, replaced by this stranger who knelt in the dust and was not afraid of blood. Elijah walked over, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He had been checking the bodies, his movements efficient and somber. His gaze fell on the blood on her dress, then rose to meet her eyes. He saw the shock and the horror, but he also saw the steel beneath it. They helped the family, the Millers. They were called, on their way to a small homestead near Fort Collins, right their wagon and tend to their remaining horse. They would travel together for the next few days, for safety. That night, as they sat around a shared campfire, the mood was subdued. Mr. Miller was resting, feverish but stable. His wife and daughter were quiet, still processing the day's violence. Josephine sat apart, staring into the flames, her hand unconsciously straying to the bloodstain on her dress. She hadn't tried to wash it out. She felt, in some strange way, that she never could. Elijah came and sat near her, the silence stretching between them. He had seen her fire the gun. He had seen her save a family. He had seen her kneel in the dirt. He had been hired to escort a lady, but that lady no longer existed. "You did good today," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. It was the highest praise he could offer. She looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted in the firelight. "Is it always like this?" she whispered. "So much violence." Elijah's gaze drifted from her face to the vast, star-dusted darkness that surrounded their small circle of light. He thought of the war, of the countless skirmishes on the trail, of Jake Bonner and his men who were still out there, waiting. He looked back at her, at the blood on her dress, and offered her no false comfort, only the hard, unyielding truth of the world they now shared. "No, ma'am," he said. "This was just the beginning." Asterisk, asterisk. Part 5, Loss and the Encroaching Dark asterisk, asterisk. They traveled with the Millers for 3 days, the 2 wagons forming a small, wounded caravan. There was a quiet solidarity between them, born from the shared experience of violence. Mr. Miller, his leg tightly bound, grimaced with every jolt of the trail but never complained. His wife and daughter, though still haunted, had found a resilient strength. For Josephine, their presence was a buffer against the grim reality of what lay ahead. In the evenings, the 2 families would share a fire, the quiet conversation a fragile defense against the immense, watchful silence of the plains. But the alliance was temporary. The miller's route eventually diverged, heading northwest toward Fort Collins, while the path to Denver plunged deeper south, into a landscape that grew increasingly menacing. The open plains were behind them now, replaced by a maze of canyons and rock-strewn passes that clawed their way toward the distant, jagged teeth of the Rocky Mountains. The trail narrowed, forcing them to navigate through tight gorges where the canyon walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, blotting out the sun and creating an unnerving twilight even at midday. Elijah grew more taciturn, his eyes in constant motion, scanning the high ridges, the shadowed crevices, the places where a man could lie in ambush. He knew this kind of terrain. It was a death trap, a place where the land itself became an enemy. He kept his rifle across his lap as he drove, a silent testament to his unease. Mary was terrified. The open prairie had been frightening enough, but this enclosed, menacing landscape preyed on her nerves. She spent most of the day inside the wagon, clutching her rosary, her face pale. She was a hothouse flower transplanted to a land of rock and thorn, and she was wilting. Josephine felt a surge of protective pity for her. Mary was her last living link to Boston, a gentle soul utterly unequipped for this world. "It feels as though the walls are closing in," Mary whispered one afternoon, peering out at the sheer rock faces that hemmed them in. "We'll be through it soon," Josephine said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Elijah says the land opens up again in a day or two." They were rounding a sharp bend in the canyon, the trail little more than a narrow ledge cut into the cliffside, 100 feet below. A shallow, rock-choked river snaked through the canyon floor. Above them, the cliffs were a chaotic jumble of loose rock and scree, baked by 1,000 years of sun. It began without a sound, a subtle vibration under the wagon wheels, a puff of dust from the cliff face high above. Elijah, riding his horse just ahead of the wagon, saw it first. His head snapped up, his face instantly a mask of horror. "Get out!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap that echoed off the rock. "Josephine, jump!" There was no time to think. The air filled with a deep, guttural rumble, the sound of the mountain tearing itself apart. Josephine, reacting on pure instinct, shoved a paralyzed Mary toward the wagon's opening and scrambled out herself, leaping from the moving wagon onto the hard-packed dirt of the trail. She landed hard, the impact jarring her to the bone. She rolled and looked back just as the world ended in a nightmare of sound and fury. It was not a slide. It was an avalanche. Tons of rock, from pebbles to boulders the size of horses, cascaded down the cliff face. The wagon was directly in its path. For a fraction of a second, she saw it, the terrified faces of the horses. Mary's small, white face framed in the canvas opening, her hand outstretched. Then it was gone. The wagon did not splinter. It was annihilated. A house-sized boulder struck it dead center, and the sturdy wooden frame imploded, vanishing under a tidal wave of rock and earth. The sound was a physical blow, a crushing roar that shook the very ground she lay on. The dust was instantaneous, a thick, choking cloud that blotted out the sun and filled her lungs. Elijah was there, materializing out of the brown haze. He grabbed her, hauling her to her feet, half dragging, half carrying her further down the trail, away from the still unstable cliff. Boulders were still thundering down, bouncing off the trail and plunging into the river below. He pushed her behind a solid pillar of rock, shielding her with his own body until the last of the stones had settled and a deathly silence fell, broken only by the ringing in Josephine's ears. The dust began to settle, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The trail was gone, buried under a massive pile of rubble, of the wagon, the horses, and Mary. There was no sign. They had been erased, swallowed by the mountain. "Mary," Josephine whispered, the name a dry, ragged croak. "Mary." She started to move toward the rock slide, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had seen. We have to dig her out." Elijah's hand on her arm was like an iron band. "Josephine, stop!" "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She began to fight him, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. "Let me go! She's in there! We have to get her!" "It's too late," he said, his voice rough with a pain that mirrored her own. "There's nothing we can do. She's gone." "No." The fight went out of her, replaced by a cold, numbing despair that was heavier than any rock. Her legs gave way, and she would have collapsed if he hadn't caught her, pulling her against him. She buried her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, and a sound tore from her throat, a sound of such raw, animal grief that it seemed to belong to someone else. She sobbed until she had no tears left, until her body was just a hollow, trembling shell. And through it all, Elijah held her. He didn't speak. He just held on, his arms a solid, unyielding anchor in the maelstrom of her grief. He looked over her head at the tomb of rock, and his face was a mask of cold fury. This was no accident. The single puff of dust, the timing, it was too perfect. This was Bonner's work. A trap. Cruel, impersonal, and devastatingly effective. He had failed. He had been paid to protect them, and one of them was now buried under 100 tons of rock. A familiar, gut-wrenching wave of loss washed over him, the same he'd felt when he held his dying brother. He had lost another person under his watch. As Josephine's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, she began to whisper, the words tumbling out in a broken litany of self-recrimination. "It's my fault. It's all my fault. If I had just agreed to go, if we hadn't been delayed, if I hadn't been so stubborn, she would still be alive. Oh, God, Mary." "This is not your fault," Elijah said, his voice fierce, cutting through her haze of guilt. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His eyes, usually so distant and guarded, were blazing with an emotion she had never seen there before. "This was a trap. This was murder. This is on Bonner, not you." But his words couldn't penetrate the wall of her guilt. She shook her head, her gaze unfocused. "She didn't want to come. She was so afraid. I made her come with me. I killed her." The sky, which had been clear and blue, was now turning a bruised purple-gray as storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks. A cold wind began to whip through the canyon, carrying the first drops of rain. They couldn't stay here. "We have to move," Elijah said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to find shelter." He salvaged what he could his horse, which had miraculously been just beyond the main slide, his rifle, and a single saddlebag that had been thrown clear. Everything else, their food, their supplies, Josephine's pistol, every last remnant of their journey was buried. He led her away from the site, away from Mary's grave. Josephine walked like a ghost, her eyes vacant, stumbling over the uneven ground. The rain began in earnest, a cold, driving downpour that soaked them in minutes. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the base of the canyon wall, little more than a deep overhang, but it was dry. Elijah gathered what little dry wood he could find and, with patient skill, coaxed a small, sputtering fire to life. They sat in the flickering light, the rain forming a curtain of silver at the mouth of the cave. The world had been reduced to this, a small circle of warmth. 2 people, and a grief so vast it seemed to fill the very air they breathed. Josephine shivered, not from the cold, but from the shock that had settled deep in her bones. Elijah took off his heavy duster and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm and smelled of leather, rain, and him. She huddled inside it, the simple act of kindness almost undoing her again. He sat beside her, so close their shoulders were touching. He said nothing, simply sharing the silence, letting her grieve. The hours passed. The storm raged outside. Inside the cave, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. Finally, In a voice so low he had to lean in to hear, she spoke. She used to brush my hair every night, 100 strokes. She said it was the secret to its shine. She had the gentlest hands. She packed my favorite books, even though she knew there was no room. She said a lady needs her poetry. A fresh wave of tears choked her words. Elijah listened, his heart aching. He was a man of action, a man of violence and survival. He didn't know the words for this kind of pain. All he knew was loss, and so he offered the only comfort he had. "I know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I know what it's like to lose someone you were supposed to protect." He looked into the fire, and she saw the ghosts gather in his eyes again. He was no longer just her escort. He was a fellow mourner in the desolate country of loss. "I'm so sorry, Josephine," he said, and the use of her first name was as startling as a shout. "I should have seen it. I should have been watching the high ground." "It's not your fault," she whispered, echoing his own words back to him, finally believing them for herself. In that moment, something shifted between them, the last vestiges of their former roles employer and employee. Lady and hireling were washed away by the rain and buried under the rock. They were simply a man and a woman, stripped of everything, clinging to a single spark of warmth in a vast, indifferent darkness. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, her exhaustion absolute. He was so solid, so real. His presence was the only thing holding her together. "He won't get away with this," Elijah murmured, his voice a deadly vow spoken into her hair. "Bonner took her. He won't take anyone else. I swear on my life. I will not lose anyone else." His promise was a shield against the darkness, a sliver of warmth against the cold despair. She turned her face into his chest, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. He was no longer the man hired to escort her. He had become her sanctuary. His journey was no longer about a contract or a destination. It was about the woman he held in his arms, in the depths of tragedy, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts. He had followed her into a place of shared sorrow, a place that felt more real than anywhere he had ever been. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could never, ever escape. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6. Secrets in the Shadows, asterisk, asterisk. The morning after the rock slide dawned gray and unforgiving. The rain had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the canyon smelling of wet stone and sorrow. The cave that had been their sanctuary now felt like a tomb, and the silence was heavy with the ghost of Mary's presence. They emerged into the pale light as survivors, stripped of everything but the clothes on their backs, a rifle, a horse, and a shared grief that bound them more tightly than any rope. Survival was a brutal and immediate master. The first day was a blur of grim necessity. Elijah, drawing on the deeply ingrained skills of a soldier, showed a stoic resolve that became Josephine's anchor. He found a small spring for water and shot a rabbit with his rifle, cooking the meager meat over a small, smokeless fire. He spoke little, but his actions were a language she was beginning to understand fluently. Every movement was about conserving energy, assessing risk, and pushing forward. He was no longer just her protector. He was her teacher in the harsh school of the wilderness. Josephine, in turn, discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed. The woman who had once complained about lumpy mattresses now slept on hard rock without a murmur. She learned to drink from a stream, to identify edible berries under his guidance, and to ignore the gnawing hunger in her belly. Her grief for Mary was a constant, hollow ache in her chest, but she channeled it, not into despair, but into a cold, hard determination. Mary had died on this journey. Josephine would be damned if she'd let that sacrifice be for nothing. They were a team now, equals in their desperation. On the third day of their slow, arduous trek on foot, leading Elijah's lone horse, they found him. He was lying near the riverbank, a well-dressed man in a city suit, His body contorted in the brush. An arrow was lodged high in his back. Beside him lay a dead horse and a leather satchel. Its contents spilled onto the ground. Elijah approached cautiously, his rifle ready. "Apache," he murmured, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs. "Or someone who wants it to look that way." The man had been dead for at least a day. There was nothing they could do for him. But as Elijah nudged the satchel with his boot, a sheaf of official-looking documents caught his eye. He knelt, his expression grim, and began to read. Josephine watched him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. His face, usually so impassive, hardened into a mask of grim understanding. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up from the papers, his winter sky eyes holding a new, dark light. "It's about you," he said, his voice flat. He handed her a letter, the paper still crisp despite its exposure to the elements. The letter was addressed to a Mr. Samuel Morrison in Denver. The signature at the bottom was from a name she recognized, a political rival of her father's in Boston. Her hands trembled as she read. The words were couched in the dry, coded language of business, but their meaning was brutally clear. It spoke of land grants, railroad right-of-ways, and mining claims. It detailed a power struggle for control of a massive swath of Colorado territory. And it referred to her marriage not as a union of two people, but as the Whitmore-Blackwood merger, a strategic alliance designed to consolidate power and lock Samuel Morrison out of the territory for good. Harrison Blackwood provided the wealth and local power. Her father provided the political connections and legitimacy from the East. And she, Josephine Whitmore, was the linchpin, the seal on the contract. She read the letter again, and then a third time, the words blurring through a haze of sudden, cold fury. All of it, the debutante balls, the finishing school, her father's lectures on duty and family honor, it was all a lie. She wasn't his cherished daughter. She was his most valuable asset, a piece of property to be traded for a mountain. Mary's death, the ambush, the blood on her dress. It wasn't just random frontier violence. It was a consequence of a game she hadn't even known she was playing. She was a pawn, and they were all casualties of her father's ambition. "He sold me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked at Elijah, her eyes blazing with a dry, tearless fire. "My own father sold me." Elijah watched her, his heart aching for the fresh hell that had just been visited upon her. He had been grappling with his own conflict since reading the documents. His contract, his word given to the judge, was to deliver her to Denver. It was a matter of professional honor, the only code he had left. But the man who had made that promise was a different man from the one who had held her while she wept in a cold cave. His loyalty now was not to the judge, not to the contract, but to the woman standing before him, whose entire world had just been shattered. To take her to Denver now felt like leading a lamb to slaughter. "Josephine," he began, his voice rough. "We can turn back. I can take you to Santa Fe, put you on a stagecoach back east." "And be what?" She cut him off, her voice sharp as broken glass. His disobedient property, a disgraced daughter to be locked away. "No." She crumpled the letter in her fist. "He may have started this journey, but I will be the one to finish it, on my own terms." She stood taller, her grief and fury forging into something new, something hard and bright like tempered steel. "I am done being a commodity to be traded. I am not a land grant or a mining claim. I am not a pawn." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. "But I cannot do this alone. Elijah, I am no longer your cargo. Will you be my partner?" It was a declaration of independence and a plea for alliance all in one. And in that moment, Elijah Cole saw her not as the judge's daughter, not as a woman to be protected, but as an equal, a fellow soldier in a war she had not chosen. His internal conflict vanished, replaced by a simple, profound clarity. "Always," he said. The single word was a vow, an oath of allegiance that superseded any contract. They buried the dead man, taking his canteen and the few remaining provisions in his satchel. The letters, they burned. As the last of the ashes scattered on the wind, they turned to face the mountains, their purpose now redefined. They were no longer just running from Bonner. They were marching toward a confrontation with the powerful men who had treated her life as a game. Their new resolve was tested almost immediately. As dusk fell, they found themselves at the entrance to a narrow, impassable-looking pass. They were exhausted, low on water, and facing a night in the open. It was then that they appeared. They made no sound. One moment the landscape was empty, the next, 3 men were there, standing on the rocks above them. They were Apache, their lean bodies blending with the landscape, their faces painted in stark, enigmatic patterns. They held bows, not rifles, and watched Elijah and Josephine with an unnerving stillness. Elijah's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but he did not raise it. He stood his ground, making no sudden moves, showing them his empty hands in a sign of peace. He knew enough of the Apache to know that any sign of aggression would be their last. One of the men, clearly the leader, slid down the rocks with the fluid grace of a cat. He was older, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his black eyes holding an ancient, unreadable wisdom. He stopped 20 feet from them, his gaze passing over Elijah and settling on Josephine. He looked at her torn, trail-worn dress, at the exhaustion etched on her face, and at the fierce, unbroken spirit in her eyes. Elijah spoke a few words of halting, broken Spanish, the trade language of the territory. "We are travelers. We seek only passage. We mean no harm." The Apache leader did not seem to hear him. His eyes remained fixed on Josephine. He spoke, his own voice the low, guttural sound of rocks grinding together, a language that seemed to rise from the earth itself. One of the younger men translated into the same rough Spanish. "He asks why you carry the sorrow of the mountain with you." Josephine, startled, did not know how to answer. Elijah replied for her. "We were attacked. A friend was lost, buried by the rock." The leader nodded slowly, as if this was information he already knew. "He said something else. He says the mountain does not kill without reason." The translator continued, "It sheds the parts that do not belong." The words were cryptic, chilling. The leader's gaze was intense, as if he were looking not at Josephine, but into her. He spoke again, a longer stream of words this time. The translator turned to them. "He says the iron path of the white man is coming. He says men like the one you found by the river, and the men who hunt you, wish to scar the land, to bleed it dry. He says their path is a path of death." Then, the leader took a step forward, his eyes still locked on Josephine. He uttered one final sentence. "He says you do not belong to the world you came from anymore. He says this land has chosen you. It has tested you with dust and blood and sorrow. It is making you into one of its own." Josephine felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The Apache's words resonated with a strange, terrifying truth. Had been changed? The woman from Boston was a distant memory, a ghost. The leader turned and pointed toward a barely visible crack in the canyon wall, a path they would never have found on their own. "There is a way through the mountains," the translator said. "A spirit path. It is not an easy journey, but it will hide you from your enemies. He offers this to you." Elijah looked at Josephine, his expression a question. To trust these men was a tremendous leap of faith, but to refuse was to remain trapped. Josephine met the Apache leader's gaze and saw no malice, only a deep, profound understanding of the world they all inhabited. She gave a single, decisive nod. "We accept," Elijah said in Spanish. "Our thanks." The leader held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and, with his men, melted back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. As night fell, Elijah and Josephine stood at the entrance to the secret path. They were leaving the known world behind, heading into the heart of the mountains. Guided by a ghost story and a cryptic prophecy, they had lost everything, only to find a new, dangerous purpose. And Josephine, no longer a pawn but a queen in a game of her own making, took her first step onto the path, feeling not the fear of the unknown, but the strange, exhilarating pull of a destiny the land itself had chosen for her. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 7. The Trap in the Night and the Duel with Bonner, asterisk, asterisk. The spirit path of the Apache was a journey through a world of stone and sky. It was a treacherous, ghost-haunted trail that wound through high passes and knife-edge ridges. A path that was more memory than reality. For days, they saw no one, subsisting on the land and the last of the dead man's provisions. The world of men, with its contracts and conspiracies, felt 1,000,000 miles away. In the harsh crucible of the mountains, they were reforged. Elijah taught Josephine how to read the clouds, how to find north by the stars, how to move without a sound. She, in turn, taught him what it was to have a partner, to share a silence that was not born of loneliness, but of trust. The grief for Mary was a constant companion, a sad, quiet ghost that walked beside them. But it no longer threatened to consume them. It had become a part of their story, the blood price of their transformation. When they finally descended from the high country, the world rushed back in. Below them, nestled in a valley, were the scattered, welcoming lights of Trinidad, an outpost of civilization on the edge of the wild. The sight should have brought relief, but instead, it filled them with a cold dread. Civilization meant lawmen, judges, and telegraph wires. It meant the long reach of men like Samuel Morrison, Harrison Blackwood, and her father. To walk into that town was to walk back onto their chessboard. They made a cold camp in the foothills overlooking the town, the distant lights like malevolent stars. "We need proof," Elijah said, his voice a low murmur as he stared down at the lights. "Without Bonner's testimony, it's just your word against theirs. They'll paint you as a hysterical female. Run off with the hired help. They'll discredit us both." "So we go to the law?" Josephine asked, though she already knew the answer. "Which law?" he countered grimly. "A town marshal in Morrison's pocket, a federal judge who's a friend of your father's. We're on our own." A heavy silence fell between them. The path forward seemed to vanish into an impenetrable wall of power and influence. It was Josephine who finally broke the silence, her voice devoid of any of its former Boston polish. It was the voice of the woman the land had chosen. "Then we don't go to them," she said, her gaze fixed and intense. "We make them come to us." Elijah turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. "Bonner is still hunting me," she continued, a chilling logic in her tone. "He thinks I'm a prize, a piece of cargo he failed to secure. He doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know that I am no longer afraid of him. That is his weakness, and it is our strength." Understanding, followed by a fierce opposition, dawned on Elijah's face. "No, absolutely not. I will not use you as bait." The words were an order, born of a deep, protective instinct that now ran deeper than any contract. "It's not your decision to make," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. The fire that had once been petulant fury was now a controlled, cold flame. "This is not about you protecting me, Elijah. This is about us finishing what they started. We set a trap. We choose the ground. We make him walk into it. I will play the part of the lost, helpless lady one last time, and when he comes for me, you will be waiting." He stared at her, at the woman who stood before him, her clothes in tatters, her face smudged with dirt and etched with a warrior's resolve. This was not the judge's daughter. This was a force of nature. To deny her this role would be to deny the very truth of who she had become. His duty to protect her and his respect for her were now at war. Respect won. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Where?" Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They chose a box canyon 2 miles south of the main trail to Trinidad. It was a perfect trap, with a single entrance and steep, rock-strewn walls that offered a dozen places for a rifleman to hide. That night, they lit a fire, deliberately large and conspicuous, a beacon for any searching eyes. They had only Elijah's horse, and he picketed it where it could be easily seen. Then, he handed Josephine his spare pistol, the smaller Colt Navy she had first learned to use. "Stay by the fire. Keep this hidden under your shawl," he instructed, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. "When they ride in, let Bonner come to you. Don't make a move until I fire the first shot. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, meeting his gaze. In his eyes, she saw not just a plan, but a desperate, terrifying fear for her safety. She reached out and her hand briefly touched his arm. "Be careful, Elijah." He squeezed her hand once, a gesture of profound, unspoken feeling. Then he melted into the darkness, climbing the canyon wall with a hunter's silent grace until he was just another shadow among the rocks above. Josephine was alone by the fire. The waiting was a physical torment. Every rustle of the wind, every skitter of a lizard in the rocks, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She forced herself to breathe, to project an aura of weary, desperate vulnerability. She was the bait. She was the prize. An hour passed, then another, just as she began to fear they wouldn't come. She heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of shod horses on rock. They were coming. 4 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the moonlight. They paused, surveying the camp. Then one man, larger than the others, trotted his horse forward. Jake Bonner. He reined in his horse 20 feet from the fire, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. Well, look what the cat dragged in. I was beginning to think the mountain had swallowed you whole, little lady." Josephine looked up, her face a carefully constructed mask of fear and exhaustion. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. My maid is gone. The wagon. Everything is gone. I'm lost." Bonner dismounted, his spurs jingling with a sound of finality. He swaggered toward her, his eyes roaming over her with a possessive insolence. "Your maid's gone. All right. And your watchdog. A shame about him. He was tough." He clearly assumed Elijah was dead. "But don't you worry. Your journey is over, mister. Morrison will be very pleased to know you won't be attending your wedding." He was close now, standing over her, basking in his victory. He reached down, his hand about to grab her arm. It was the last mistake he would ever make. The crack of Elijah's rifle from the cliffs above was like a thunderclap in the enclosed canyon. Bonner's hat flew from his head. Before the outlaw could even react, Elijah fired again. One of the riders behind Bonner cried out and toppled from his saddle, his gun clattering on the rocks. Chaos erupted. The remaining 2 riders opened fire wildly toward the cliffs. Bonner, snarling like a cornered wolf, drew his pistol and dove for the cover of a nearby boulder, firing back at the muzzle flash from above. One of the riders, seeing Josephine as an easy target, spurred his horse directly at her, but he had underestimated her. As he charged, she threw off her shawl, the Colt Navy appearing in her hand as if by magic. She didn't hesitate. She fired once. The man grunted, clutching his leg, his charge turning into a pained, uncontrolled swerve. Elijah's rifle cracked again. The second rider fell. Now it was just Bonner, pinned behind the rock. He fired toward the cliffs, then toward Josephine, the bullets whining past her. She scrambled away from the fire, taking cover behind another cluster of rocks, her heart pounding. Elijah's voice echoed from the darkness above, cold and commanding. "It's over. Bonner, drop the gun." "Go to hell, Cole!" Bonner roared back, firing again. The deadly stalemate held for a long minute. Then, Elijah did something unexpected. He worked the lever of his rifle, ejecting the last spent casing, and then deliberately threw the weapon down onto the sandy canyon floor. He was disarmed. "Just you and me now. Bonner," Elijah called out, his voice calm. He began to climb down from his perch. In full view, Bonner, seeing his chance, rose from behind the rock, his pistol leveled at Elijah's chest. "You're a fool, Cole." "Maybe," Elijah said, his feet touching the ground. "But I'm not a man who shoots from the dark." At that exact moment, Josephine rose from her own cover, her pistol aimed squarely at Bonner's back. "Drop it," she said, her voice ringing with cold authority. "Now!" Bonner froze, trapped. His head swiveled from Elijah in front to Josephine behind. He was a wolf caught between two hunters. With a curse, he threw his pistol into the dust. They had him. The surviving henchman, clutching his wounded leg, had already surrendered. They tied Bonner securely to a rock. Elijah stood over him, his face a grim mask. While Josephine watched, her pistol still held steady. "It's over," Elijah said to Bonner. "You're going to tell us everything. Why you were hired. Who paid you?" Bonner just spat on the ground. "I ain't telling you nothing." Josephine stepped forward, the firelight catching the steel in her eyes. "You work for Samuel Morrison," she stated. Not a question, but a fact. "He hired you to stop my marriage to Harrison Blackwood, to stop the Whitmore-Blackwood merger." Bonner's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "How?" "You killed my friend," she continued, her voice trembling with a controlled rage. "You buried Mary under a mountain because of a business deal. You are nothing but a rich man's dog on a leash." That hit a nerve. Bonner's face contorted with a dark, prideful fury. He strained against his ropes. "I ain't no man's dog," he snarled. "Morrison is a snake, just like your father, just like Blackwood. They sit in their fancy offices and move people around a map like they're playing checkers. They wanted the wedding stopped, and they paid me to stop it. The rock slide. That was my own idea. Cleaner that way." He looked at Josephine then, a strange, bitter light in his eyes. It was not remorse, but a kind of disgusted kinship. "I've robbed folks, run off cattle, and been in more gunfights than I can count," he said, the words a low, venomous growl. "I've done a lot of things I ain't proud of, but forcing a woman into a marriage she don't want, that's their kind of dirty business, not mine." The confession hung in the air, more damning than any legal document. They had it. They had the proof. They stood in the quiet canyon, the fire burning low, their prisoners bound and silent. They had won. They had faced the monster of the wilderness and beaten him. But as Elijah looked at Josephine, at the smoking pistol still in her hand and the hard, ancient knowledge in her eyes, he knew their fight was far from over. Bonner was just a symptom. The disease was civilization itself, with its greedy, powerful men and its stifling rules. They had survived the trail. But Elijah feared that surviving the society that awaited them in Trinidad would be the harder battle yet. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 8, The Freedom of Choice, asterisk, asterisk. The arrival of Elijah Cole and Josephine Whitmore in Trinidad was not the quiet, dignified entrance of a bride-to-be, but the chaotic, dust-choked spectacle of a reckoning. They rode in not with a fine carriage, but with Elijah's single, trail-worn horse, leading two others they had taken from Bonner's men. Behind them, Jake Bonner and his wounded henchmen were tied to their saddles, their faces a mixture of sullen defeat and pained resignation. The sight of the infamous outlaw being brought to justice by a lone, grim-faced man and a woman in a tattered dress brought the town to a standstill. Doors and windows flew open, and a crowd of curious onlookers gathered as Elijah handed his prisoners over to a stunned but capable town marshal, stating only that they were wanted for ambush and murder on the trail. Word traveled faster than a telegraph signal. Within the hour, A message was delivered to the modest room they had taken at the hotel. It was a summons. Harrison Blackwood requested their presence at his suite in the Trinidad Grand Hotel, the finest establishment in town. As they walked through the lobby, a world of polished wood and velvet far grander than the one they had left in Independence, Josephine felt the weight of her old life trying to settle back onto her shoulders. Men in fine suits and women in elegant dresses stared, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. But she was no longer the woman who would have withered under their scrutiny. She met their gazes with a calm, steady look that made them turn away. Beside her, Elijah walked with the quiet confidence of a man who was out of place but utterly unintimidated. He was her anchor, a piece of the steadfast, honest wilderness in this den of civilized vipers. Harrison Blackwood was not what she had expected. He was not an old, corpulent tycoon, but a man in his prime, with the powerful build of a miner and the cold, assessing eyes of a gambler who never lost. He stood by the window of his opulent suite, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Standing near the fireplace, looking deeply uncomfortable, was the architect of the whole affair, Samuel Morrison. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwood said, his voice a low, powerful baritone. "Mr. Cole, you have caused quite a stir. I am told you have brought Jake Bonner to town." "We did," Josephine said, her voice clear and steady. She would not be intimidated. "He had a great deal to say." At this, Samuel Morrison shifted, his face paling. "He confessed," Josephine continued, her eyes locked on Morrison, "to being hired by you to stop my journey to Denver, to ensure that the Whitmore-Blackwood merger, as you called it, never took place. He also confessed to orchestrating the rock slide that killed my maid, Mary." A heavy, dangerous silence filled the room. Blackwood turned his cold gaze from Josephine to Morrison. "Is this true, Samuel?" Morrison began to stammer, a pathetic cascade of denials and blustering indignation. "This is preposterous. The word of a common outlaw against a respected businessman. She's clearly been influenced by this ruffian," he said, gesturing at Elijah. Elijah didn't even blink. "Bonner is in the marshal's custody," Josephine said calmly. "He is more than willing to testify in exchange for a lesser charge. He seems to have developed a particular dislike for you." The color drained completely from Morrison's face. He was trapped. Blackwood's expression was terrifying in its stillness. He was a man who understood betrayal. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "It seems, Samuel," Blackwood said, his voice soft but laced with menace, "that you and I will have a great deal to discuss with the federal marshal. You may wait for him in the adjoining room." He gestured with his glass, and the command was absolute. A defeated Morrison shuffled out of the room, his empire crumbling around him. Blackwood then turned his full attention to Josephine. "It appears I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore. I was a party to a business arrangement. I had no idea it involved such extreme measures." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not warmth, but a grudging respect. "You are not what I was led to expect. And you, Mr. Blackwood, are exactly what I was led to expect," she replied, a sharp edge to her voice. "A man who would conduct a marriage as a business merger. Therefore, consider this my official notice: the merger is off. The wedding is canceled. I will not be your wife." Before Blackwood could respond, the door to the suite opened. Judge Lawrence Whitmore stood there, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He had arrived in Trinidad that morning, expecting to greet his compliant daughter and finalize his grand alliance. Instead, he had walked into a firestorm of rumor and scandal. "Josephine!" he thundered, his eyes sweeping over her tattered dress and the quiet, formidable man standing beside her. "What is the meaning of this outrage? You have made a public spectacle of yourself. You will honor your commitment to Mr. Blackwood. I command it." "Your commands no longer have any power over me, Father," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the strength of iron forged in fire. "You sent me into a war zone without even telling me I was a soldier. You used me as a bargaining chip, a piece of property to secure your political ambitions. Mary is dead because of your ambition. I nearly died because of it." The judge was momentarily speechless, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "I did what was necessary for the future of this family. I did it to secure your position." "My position?" A bitter, incredulous laugh escaped her. "My position was to be a broodmare in a gilded cage. I have found my own position now. It is here, standing on my own 2 feet, making my own choices, the first of which is that I will not marry a man I do not love for a mountain I do not want." She stood before him, not as his child, but as his equal, a woman who had faced death and had not blinked. The judge stared at her, and for the first time, the fury in his eyes began to waver, replaced by a stunned, reluctant comprehension. He was not looking at the girl he had sent from Boston. He was looking at a stranger, a woman carved from the very rock and dust of the West he so disdained. Blackwood, ever the pragmatist, broke the tense silence. "Judge," he said, his voice calm and decisive, "the young lady has made her position clear. And frankly, after Mr. Morrison's treachery, a marriage founded on such a shaky alliance is no longer appealing. However," he added, his eyes gleaming with a businessman's foresight, "a business partnership, based on your Eastern connections and my Western resources, is still a very sound proposition, perhaps even a more profitable one." The judge looked from Blackwood's shrewd face to his daughter's unyielding one. His grand plan was in ruins, but a new, perhaps better one was rising from the ashes. His shoulders, which had been rigid with anger, slumped almost imperceptibly. He looked at Elijah, truly seeing him for the first time not as the hired help, but as the man who had stood by his daughter, who had brought her through the fire. He saw the quiet strength, the unwavering loyalty in the man's eyes. He let out a long, slow sigh of defeat, of acceptance, of something that might have been pride. "Your mother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "She never did approve of the men I chose for her. She always preferred a man with calluses on his hands and honesty in his eyes. She would have liked him." It was not a blessing, but it was an acknowledgement, and for Josephine, it was enough. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 2 days later, they rode out of Trinidad. They did not ride east, toward the world of politics and arranged marriages, nor did they ride toward the cold, mineral wealth of Denver. They turned their horses west, toward the distant promise of a sun-drenched coast, toward a place called California. They had new horses, new supplies purchased with the last of the judge's money, a parting gift, a silent peace offering. They rode side by side, no longer an escort and his charge, but partners. The trail stretched out before them, a dusty ribbon of possibility winding through a landscape that was no longer an enemy, but a home. The world was still a dangerous place. There would be other storms, other ambushes, other sorrows, but they would face them together. Josephine looked over at Elijah, at the man who had been hired to deliver her to a gilded cage but had ended up following her into a love he couldn't escape. He caught her gaze, and a slow, rare smile touched his lips, a smile that reached the winter sky of his eyes and filled them with a quiet warmth. Her old life of privilege and protection had been a prison. This new life, fraught with danger and uncertainty, was freedom. The truest freedom, she now understood, was not the absence of hardship, but the liberty to choose who you faced it with. And she had chosen, she had paid the price for that choice in blood and tears. And in return, she had been given not a mountain of gold, but something far more precious, a love as vast and untamed as the West itself. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and consider supporting it further by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by more people.